Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. The world is a mess, and people are hungry for answers. That's pretty much situation normal. There's the historical challenges we face: war, tyranny, the powerful, famine, poverty, plague, the age of decay. And then these things come at us in contemporary clothing: environmental collapse, demand on resources, overcrowding, and politics always seems to be in crisis. Came across a very interesting video a couple of weeks ago by a guy named Jordan Hall. Most of the people in the church won't recognize him. Some of you in the YouTube community will. And he talked about three levels of normativity, let's say. Norms, which are sort of implicit interrelational norms. It's how we act one to another when we sort of enforce them with approval and disapproval. Laws, which are formal and enforced and are overt and passed by legislatures or by kings or by ruling parties. And then he talked about another level called deep code, which he talked about as sort of nature's law. Some of you will connect it to natural law. And it's basically mechanisms built into the world. Now, if you're living sort of out there in the natural order, the natural laws seem to govern, but increasingly as we live within human constructed cities and environments, the design built into those constructions are increasingly the deep code that we live out of. And this is code written by human beings, and it tends to perpetuate over time. And one of the issues that he brought up in this was what he called the crisis of the commons. Now, that might not be a word that we think of a lot, but let me map it out a little bit. Oceans are sort of like commons, and oceans have been in crisis for a while by overfishing and pollution. Air is a commons. If you take a look at maps, you'll notice that pollution from China wafts over that enormous Pacific Ocean and hits the west coast of the United States. What happens in other places of the world, both in the air and the water, comes back to other places in the world as well. And so we're sort of living and sharing one ecosystem, but there's no legal organizational branch over it. Of course, the United Nations tries, and international treaties try to manage these things, but they always seem to be sort of they can't quite handle the scope of the commons. And so we have a crisis of commons. Is the Amazon rainforest a commons? Well, with a lot of talk about CO2 emissions and carbon sinks and all those kinds of things, if the Amazon rainforest gets leveled by local farmers who are trying to raise cattle and build a life, well, does that impact the climate and the rest of the world? Amazon rainforest would sort of be owned by certain national entities such as countries, but we all seem to have a share in its welfare. And so in many ways now in the planet we have a crisis of commons, and we're visiting the limits of the legal. Now let me give an example that's quite a bit closer to home. Park Street Congregational is the church of my brother-in-law and my sister who passed away, and it's situated right there on the Boston Commons. Well, what was the Boston Commons? Well, the Boston Commons was a field. It was an open space that anybody could graze their sheep and use it. Now, seeing as most current inhabitants of Boston no longer have sheep, what has it become? Well, it's sort of become a park, a public park. And for many of us, that's sort of the sense of commons that we have today. It's not a collective where there's a group of owners, or a cooperative where it's sort of owned by a corporation. It's supposed to be public, open for all. But obviously, if people, let's say, squat in it or move into it and build a shack in it and try to possess it, that's a violation of the commons. And today, public parks, well, you can sort of go there, but there are restrictions on them. But there are implicit obligations in the commons. You're supposed to, as you say with, say, national parks, leave it better than you found it. No one owns it. You have the sense of, in terms of the wilderness, but all must care for it. And we don't really have sort of a conceptualization about this. And so that's where this deep code comes in, that there seemed to need to be an unwritten code that everyone goes by. Now, for each of us, in many ways, our coding gets built into us by our youth. It's something that everyone knows, and by everyone, we usually mean us and the people around us who share our culture or our context, the people around us that we get along well with. Laws and norms around, but laws and norms laws and norms are around this deep code, but they really point to a deeper normativity, one that's sort of hard for us to articulate. Now, as I listened to this, and I actually did a video commenting on it, one of the things that occurred to me was that the sacred and the holy actually create the commons. In many cases, it's God's land or it's God's world, and that fear of the Lord, that understanding that there is someone above looking down on us. Well, we don't want to foul the oceans because they belong to God, and our neighbors depend on them. We don't want to foul the air because it belongs to God, even though no government or country owns it. So we shouldn't foul it for others. Don't violate the sacred, or divine judgment will fall on you. Now, this very much is shown in many places in the Bible. Psalm 14 talks about it directly. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now, in the ancient world, there wasn't really anything like the atheism we have today. Basically, what that fool says in his heart is that God does not patrol the commons. God does not watch over the commons. God's justice is not enacted with respect to the commons. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. Their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on all mankind to see if there are any who understand, any who seek God. All have turned away. All have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Do all these evildoers know nothing? They devour my people as though eating bread. They never call on the Lord, but they are overwhelmed with dread, for God is present in the company of the righteous. Have you ever noticed that, let's say on the playground, when one kid refuses to participate in the silent cooperation of evil that everyone knows is evil? You evildoers frustrate the plans of the poor, but the Lord is their refuge. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion when the Lord restores his people. Let Jacob rejoice and Israel be glad. Now, at the beginning of Advent, we read in the book of Isaiah, oh, that God would rend the heavens. And now in Christmas, we see God has in fact invaded, but he has invaded through the life of one young woman. God announces his intention to marry, in contrast to Zechariah in Luke chapter 1, and she accepts as best she can. God would instead open the virgin's birth canal, and she and her son would be in pain like the rest of us. Now, the story this morning comes from Luke chapter 2, and it comes at a rite. Now, it seems like a ceremonial rite. In some Christian traditions, it's dedication of a baby is sort of a happy ceremonial thing, and certainly there's a degree of joy to it. But the fact that it's held in the temple, the fact that it, at least in Jesus' time, was conducted with a sacrifice of blood, will probably take a little bit of shine off it. When the time came for purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. Now, just mentioning it here seems just sort of plain to us who aren't used to this, but these doves and these pigeons will be butchered at the temple. The doves and the pigeons will lose their life at the temple. Their life will be in exchange for the life of the Son. And you might say, well, why should there be an exchange for the life of the firstborn? Doesn't that child belong to himself, or at least to the mother? All of this goes back to Exodus 13. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male. The offspring of every womb among Israelites belongs to me, whether human or animal." And of course, this is right in the middle of the context of the plagues. After the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites and gives it to you, as he promised on oath to you and your ancestors, you are to give over to the Lord the first offspring of every womb. All of the firstborn males of your livestock belong to the Lord. Redeem with a lamb every firstborn donkey. Now again, you might say, well, what's with the donkey? Well, the donkey was an unclean animal. You couldn't offer a donkey up for sacrifice in the temple. So in other words, even with the donkey, something else had to substitute. The same for a child. Something else has to substitute. You can't offer a human. Human sacrifice was not permissible in the Mosaic law. But if you do not redeem it, break its neck of the donkey. Redeem every firstborn among your sons. In days to come, when your sons ask you, "What does this mean?" say to him, "With a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed the firstborn of both people and animals in Egypt." The firstborn of Egypt bought the freedom of the children of Israel. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the firstborn, the first male offspring of every womb, and redeem each of my firstborn sons. Right there. Israel knew she had been bought with a price. Every firstborn belonged to the Lord. Now, part of the way this is negotiated with in the land of Egypt is that the Levites are dedicated to the Lord. Well, what does that mean? That they sort of become a living sacrifice to be of service to God in the temple. And this will be a sign on your hand and a symbol on your forehead that the Lord brought us out of Egypt with his mighty hand. So Jesus goes to the temple, and Mary and Joseph offer a sacrifice to redeem him from the Lord. Now, there's things going all different ways in this. Well, you see, the sacred creates the commons. Commoners used the commons. The common is the space so that there would be no poor among you. Anyone can have access to it according to their need, but the point of the sacrifice is that nothing is free. It all belongs to the Lord. And that belonging to the Lord is deeply connected with the commons and the deep code that protects the commons from ourselves. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness therein. And when we find nothing sacred, we take and devour, and those without power get nothing. And that's when we cry out, usually when we ourselves have felt violated. Is nothing sacred? And for many in the modern world, the answer is no. Nothing is sacred. But when nothing is sacred, everything is up for grabs for those who can. Jesus is presented in the temple, and he's redeemed by a blood sacrifice of animals, their life for his well-being and his freedom. Now there was a man in Jerusalem named Simeon who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel. Well, what did that mean? Well, Israel laid in captivity, empire after empire, year after year, all of these promises of Israel that were built into her sacrificial system, built into her memory, built into her identity, generation after generation, unmet, unfulfilled. Simeon, an old man, he was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel. Lord, will you make good your promise to your people? And the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah, the Lord's anointed one. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and, praising God, said, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, Now you may dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, for which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people Israel. Simeon sees restoration is coming, not just for the Jews, but for the world. The child's father and mother marveled at what had been said about him. And then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and the rising of many in Israel, and it will be a sign that it will be spoken again, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your soul too." There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was very old and had lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. Same theme. What are we building here in this passage? Luke tells these 3 stories. The first story, nothing is free. Jesus himself, the Messiah, must be redeemed. He is the firstborn, the invader through the Virgin's birth canal into the world, comes in and must be bought with a price. 2 doves or 2 pigeons. Next, he's spotted by Simeon. And Simeon says, this is the one who will redeem Israel, but it will be costly and it will be difficult. And the third, Anna, who comes and says, this is the redemption of Israel. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth, and the child grew and became strong and was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. Now again, we started talking about norms, laws, and deep code. Normativity. Norms are the interrelational. Laws are the legal. Jesus here fulfills the law, and his parents fulfill it for him. The deep code, the way things are deep underneath. What they're looking for is for the world to once again be restored in terms of both the sacred and the common. Now, the world is a mess, and people are hungry for answers. We're trying to stretch law to what it cannot do on its own, trying to sort of manage the commons by having nations do right by the law, but will they cheat? Will they do right? Is war the only way to hold nations accountable? Our relationships with each other are stressed because we're trying to make norms. The interpersonal relationships perform what they are able to do. We have a need for deep code, and we don't know where to find it, and we don't know where to look. We recognize no deep code, something common to us all, and so we hunger for a commons that is set right. The sacrifice points to the holy. The firstborn son is holy. He belongs to the Lord, but he is redeemed and given to the world. The animal sacrifice is made temporarily for Jesus. This sacrifice points to the sacrifice Jesus himself will become. Every sacrifice pointed to him. Jesus will be the holy sacrifice to restore the commons to the world. Well, how will he do that? What do we mean by that? Well, notice the Apostle Paul in the law. What does he say about the law? The law is an intermediary. It points to something bigger than itself, but it restrains. It tries to do what it can, but when law increases, sin increases as well. It's a stopgap measure, and it continues to show us how we're not connected with the deep code. We need a deeper transformation. And this is what the sacrifice for Jesus and the prophecy of Simeon and Anna point to. You can actually find it in the book of Jeremiah. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a covenant with the peoples of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt. That's the covenant that Mary and Joseph fulfilled at the temple by buying Jesus back. Because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the peoples of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. This is, in fact, what Jesus is pointing to, a renewal of the commons, where law and norms, in a sense, are no longer needed, because the deep code is pervasive and guides all. I will put my laws on their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, there are the norms, know the Lord, because they will all know me. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. What this points to is the resolution of the crisis of the commons. This is how there can be freedom and responsibility. This is how the deep code is known by all. This is how the commons is shared responsibly by all, for all, where poverty is no more, and abuse and the kind of manipulation and taking is no more. It's thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.